Welcome to Fax Machine. It's the dog days of summer here, and no one is more aware of that than us, as we've turned off the air conditioning because, we've been told, it affects the quality of our audio. So we'll be sweating it out for this episode. But you've made it to episode 7, where today we'll be discussing today's theme, Unsung Heroes. So, in order to celebrate Unsung Heroes, I will now read to you the lyrics of Mariah Carey's 1993 hit, Hero. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, no.
Some disappointment in the room. No, what we'll actually be doing is that each of us will share a fact about an interesting or unheard of individual and the impact that they've had on modern life. So we'll discuss these facts a little bit, and to wrap it up, I'll conduct a pub-style quiz loosely inspired by the theme. Before we dive in, just a reminder, check us out on social media at Fax Machine Pod on Instagram and Twitter, and Fax Machine Podcast on Facebook. And if you listen on any major audio platform, please drop us a rating or a review. So to begin, I'll hand it off to Noah.
Thanks, Rob. This week I learned that Archbishop Isidore of Seville solved one of the biggest problems in the ancient world: how to catch a unicorn. His solution? Virgins.
It's funny because it makes so much sense now.
I mean, who could imagine a world where unicorns still roam free without the solution that old Izzy came up for us? I mean, virgins, they're as plentiful as Wi-Fi these days.
Yes. As the old saying goes, as plentiful as Wi-Fi.
Well, they're spreading like Wi-Fi.
Oh, God.
Well, this is starting great. So, ancient texts such as the Hebrew Bible, as well as ancient thinkers like Pliny the Elder and Aristotle, had written that unicorns were so dangerous that they were impossible to catch alive. I think it was Pliny who wrote that they can take down elephants using their horn. They're super fast. They can't be caught by any man trying to hunt them and catch them. And that is until 6th century Bishop Isidore of Seville took the case. Of the ferocity of the unicorn, he writes, "It is very strong and pierces anything it attacks." Thankfully, Izzy goes on to say, "The unicorn is too strong to be caught by hunters except by a trick. If a virgin girl is placed in front of a unicorn and she bares her breast to it, all of its fierceness will cease and it will lay its head on her bosom, and thus quieted it is easily caught."
It's a hypothesis.
And so this came from Isidore of Seville was writing in the 6th century, like a natural history, and the idea was to sort of like collate, everything that was known about the world. So all these people were writing about unicorns being these terrible beasts that nobody could take down, and that was like the one thing that showed up repeatedly throughout all these different, works of literature from a long time ago, until Isidore of Seville actually suggested a solution. So at some point, somebody came up with this idea to add to the mythology of this unicorn, and he had incorporated that, and that was the first time that solution was ever given. And it occurs to me that in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Professor Quirrell and Voldemort kill a unicorn. So, so this obsessed me for the entire time I'm working on this fact, because I never really thought about Professor Quirrell or Voldemort having sexual relationships with anyone or each other. I don't know. But I was forced to consider whether Quirrell or Voldemort were virgins. So this is the question that led me to a number of Reddit threads.
Oh, dear.
And even an article on Slate, believe it or not, that exhaustively cover this topic. And you'll be happy to know that the consensus is that Voldemort never had sex. So now I'm forced to imagine Voldemort bearing his breast to a unicorn, and now so are you. So for that image, you have Isidore of Seville to thank for his solution to one of the most terrible problems of the ancient world. The fact that Europe was just lousy with unicorns.
See, I have another bone to pick, which is the fact that you forced me to Google things like unicorn and virgin. So I also thought it was interesting how unicorns are mentioned in the Bible, and I wondered exactly what did God mean? This is the question I asked myself. And so I looked up some of the verses. So unicorns are mentioned in the book of Numbers twice, And the Bible, like you mentioned, speaks of their strength and the power of a unicorn. Later in Deuteronomy and in the book of Psalms twice, the unicorn is mentioned for its horn. It's a very unique horn among animals. In the book of Job, there's a verse that speaks about how unicorns do not till the earth. So they're untamed. And again, in the book of Psalms, is probably one of the longer quotes, is how a unicorn is like a young calf skipping. And finally, Isaiah mentions unicorns are related to bulls and bullocks. So a lot of very vague but animal references to the unicorn. Trying to figure out exactly what they meant, if they really meant the unicorn that we think of today, which I think is pretty universally agreed upon, that they weren't picturing like the white rainbow unicorn that we all kind of know and love.
It's interesting that in many different ancient cultures there is the tradition of some animal often having hooves that has a single horn coming out of its forehead. In a couple instances, there are one-horn animals found on some seals from the Indus Valley civilization, but also in East Asian cultures, and particularly in Korea, the Kirin was a mythical hooved chimerical creature that apparently has a single horn, and that in a particularly interesting instance was mistranslated likely to unicorn. In 2012, North Korea claimed that its archaeologists had discovered a unicorn lair in a park in central Pyongyang. According to the press release, they knew it was a unicorn lair because a rock outside the cave was carved with the words unicorn lair, which I imagine was very helpful to the researchers. But whether or not this, word, or whether this animal is sort of directly analogous to unicorn is confusing, but there are these kind of myths that appear in a lot of different cultures, so that's very interesting.
That's cool. And actually even Marco Polo in his adventures thought he saw a unicorn and actually wrote about such in his Travels of Marco Polo, where he detailed all of his adventures afterwards. And just to kind of cite a passage, and you guys can probably figure out what he was actually describing. There are wild elephants in the country and numerous unicorns, which are very nearly as big. They have hair like that of a buffalo, feet like those of an elephant, and a horn in the middle of the forehead, which is black and very thick. 'Tis a passing ugly beast to look upon, and is not in the least like that which our stories tell us, as being caught in the lap of a virgin. In fact, 'tis altogether different from what we fancied. So what do you guys think that
They talking about rhinos?
Yeah, exactly. That's what we think, at least.
So I'll tell you why rhinos definitely aren't unicorns, and that's because they don't have a horn. Their horn that you think of is actually made of hair, and it's not a bone.
Really?
Yeah.
It's just really thick. Wow.
Although one of the original translations of unicorn in the Bible was a monoceros.
Monoceros, yeah.
Yeah.
And just another fact right off of that is that commonly unicorn horns that were like traded around, particularly in medieval Europe and even today, were actually narwhal tusks. And the genus and species name of the narwhal is Monodon monoceros.
That makes sense.
So interesting you mentioned narwhals, because I did look up unicorns and unicorn horns, and I have a record of during Queen Elizabeth I's reign, she received a carved and bejeweled narwhal tusk worth approximately 10,000 British pounds, the cost of a castle, or $2.5 million in 2007 currency.
Wow. Based on that value, I'm wondering if you have an estimate for how much the actual real-life Danish monarch's throne is, according to legend, it's made of unicorn horns. So the entire chair, the throne. Oh, wow. Imagine like the Iron Throne from Game of Thrones, but just like unicorn horns, right? This is a real thing. You can look it up. And in reality, it's entirely made of narwhal tusks. So I wonder how expensive that chair would have been. How many castles you could have gotten for that.
Oh my goodness.
Interesting. Well, part of why they were so valuable back then wasn't so much that they were rare, but also their supposed medicinal properties that they had. In particular, they were considered able to cure all sorts of different maladies. They could purify water like little medieval Brita filters. And more importantly, especially in the case of royalty, they were thought to be an antidote to all poisons ever. And actually, I've read a little bit on this narwhal tusk debunking as well, and one of the first people to do that was actually this 17th century Danish physician named Ole Worm, but his name is actually spelled Olworm, which I think is much funnier, so I'm just going to call him that.
Olworm.
Olworm. But basically, he made it his business to collect all sorts of weird relics and artifacts from all over the world and study them. And in doing so, debunked a lot of weird misconceptions that were held at the time, including, actually in a callback to our previous episode, he disproved it was apparently a myth at the time that lemmings were spontaneously generated and fell out of the sky.
Yeah.
He determined that they were rodents
they were
and didn't do that.
People who believed that were probably standing under the cliff the Disney producers were driving them off of. Where are they coming from?
It's raining lemons.
Exactly. But yeah, he also determined that unicorn horns were actually narwhal horns, but wasn't totally convinced they weren't still magically curative. So he opted to experiment about this by basically poisoning all of his pets and then giving them ground up narwhal horn to cure them all. And he said, oh no, they are magical because it worked, which suggests to me more so that he wasn't very good at poisoning his pets.
Yeah.
It's hard to be
Anyways.
hard on somebody for that. Hey, you're so bad at poisoning your pets.
Good at everything else, but poisoning his pets.
One last interesting thing. The national animal of Scotland is the unicorn.
Mm.
And I found this really interesting on visitscotland.com, which is the main tourism website for Scotland. You can see a list of all the best unicorns that are depicted in sculpture and art around Scotland, which is actually a super cool idea for a road trip, if anybody is down.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty neat.
Yeah.
Here for it.
My last thing is kind of the idea that now unicorns are all, they can all fly on rainbows and they're all beautiful white horses. And where did this come from? There are probably a few sources, but like kind of the one that really cemented it in modern popular culture is My Little Pony. And
Wow.
My Little Pony really codified the idea that like horses can fly and they have rainbows and they're amazing. On My Little Pony, I don't know if anyone here watches Bob's Burgers.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's an excellent episode about the. They don't have My Little Pony. They have the Equestronauts, which is their equivalent show that the daughter Tina is very interested in. But this is a total sidetrack trivia. There's a group of grown men who go to EquestriCon, which is a Comic-Con for My Little Pony fans.
Sure.
Do you know the name of the grown men that dress up as ponies?
In real life?
In Bob's Burgers.
Oh.
No, I don't recall.
So they're called Equesticles.
I was gonna say Equestronauts.
Oh, that's
that also
I
works.
almost said that. I didn't want to go to the gutter right away.
Yeah, but
Rob.
that's where it is.
Bob's Burgers did. I actually have one more thing about the closest we've gotten to having unicorns in real life. So there was this biologist named W. Franklin Dove. He's a professor at the University of Maine. And for some reason, he took it upon himself to see if he could make actual unicorns. So in the paper that he submitted to what at the time was a pop science magazine called Scientific Monthly, the paper being titled Artificial Production of the Fabulous Unicorn, he describes his procedure of performing surgery on really young calves, goats, or various horned farm animals, where he'd remove their horn buds, which were kind of precursor structures to horns that weren't yet fused to their skulls, and then reimplant them in the middle of their foreheads closer together. So that way, as they grew, they would grow fused and kind of mold around each other into a single horn, like a unicorn.
I feel like this doesn't have a good chance of working.
It apparently did. There are pictures and they're pretty creepy. But apart from being weird, there was actually some interesting science that came from this, particularly in that it was kind of an early investigation of stem cells and connective tissue. But also behaviorally, it was observed that the bulls that had a single horn had different behavioral patterns. So they were more aggressive and considered to be more dominant by the rest of their herds. And they also learned to use it as a tool to clear various obstacles and instigate fights with their bulls. So apparently, if we did have real unicorns, they could take over the world. That's what I'm taking away from this.
Wow.
All right, thanks, Noah. With our next fact, Emily, what do we got?
Thanks very much. So my unsung hero is Anne Royal, who is unfortunately not remembered as the first American woman journalist, an influential voice and whistleblower in the post-revolutionary political scene, and a thoroughly persistent, unabashedly honest, and all-around badass lady. So the premise of my fact comes from a historical anecdote that centers around her, though actually as I was doing more research, I found out that while that story sums up her character astonishingly well, as you'll see, it's purely apocryphal, though not disproven, but not proven either. So with that disclaimer in mind, I'm still going to tell that story and her story because they're both great and worth telling. So her story starts, hashtag her story, starts with starts with the death of her husband, William Royal, who was a retired major of the American Revolution. They actually met back when she took a position as his maid in her early 20s, and he, apparently sensing her intellect pretty quickly, funded her education and study of literature. So upon his death, his family insisted that their marriage was a fraud and basically denied her any inheritance. So she did what any single penniless 18th century woman would do and spent the next 25 years touring all 24 states at the time. All the while making a name for herself through writing 2 novels and a series of essays that were described as, quote, informative but sardonic portraits of the elite and their denizens from Mississippi to Maine.
Nice.
So during that time, she made many acquaintances of the influential and political variety, and the anecdote that I mentioned earlier is actually about how she met her first presidential acquaintance, John Quincy Adams. So, as the story goes, while visiting D.C. in hopes of claiming her late husband's military pension, Anne set her mind to become the first woman to interview a president. And she made the request through JQA's office, who unsurprisingly turned her away. But she was not deterred and did some journalism, which, given her company and social status, probably took the form more so of strategic hobnobbing, to figure out a way to pin him down. So, John Quincy Adams, he was known for generally being a really disciplined and diligent guy, both in his office and also in his health. In particular, he'd start every day with some really early morning exercise, either a 2-mile walk around Washington or, more often, a swim in the nude, which was apparently common back then. So Anne figured out that he had this habit, and she saw an opportunity. And after, just by sheer happenstance, stumbling upon one of his skinny dipping sessions and sitting on his clothes that he left folded on the shore, she floated the idea of an interview to him once more. And she basically sat in his clothes, refused to leave her perch until he spoke with her, so naturally he acquiesced, having no other option. So this is surprising to me, and probably generally, but she and he actually remained lifelong friends after this encounter. I guess he appreciated her persistence. But the fact that she, had this tendency to satirize and criticize the social and political mores of her time, as well as one to whistleblow any corruption or bull S-word she saw, no matter how high status or well-respected the perpetrator, tended to earn her more enemies than friends. So she was physically attacked, arrested, and socially ostracized throughout various points of her lengthy journalistic career. But despite that, still managed to secure interviews with presidents from George Washington to Abraham Lincoln, serves the editor of her own publication, and generally strike fear into the hearts of prominent politicians and men in power. This all during a time when the expectations of women were limited to wearing bonnets and churning butter, I assume. Newspapers and other written records during her career described how Capitol Hill bowed down in fear of her and called her hilarious scathing names, which I'll list a few because they're great, like serpent-tongued, a common scold, a literary wildcat from the backwoods, which I think is flattering.
So it's a long one.
Yeah. And my personal favorite, though this was actually said of her by John Quincy Adams, so it was really more in admiration than in scorn, a virago errant in enchanted armor.
Wow.
And actually one of my favorite accounts of her, one newspaper said that her writing served, in quotes, the detestable purpose of a woman whose brazen face effrontery is without parallel and whose old age and the decay of personal beauty have unfitted her for employment, which at an earlier period in life yielded her a comfortable though infamous support.
God.
So, in reading about Anne Royal, what surprised me the most was how unsung she actually was, in particular by her successors in the suffragette movement. Interestingly, it seems that the merciless criticism that made her a powerhouse also relegated her, at least for some time, to the dustbin of feminist history. She was actually snubbed by the suffragettes, who were starting to do their thing in her later years of life, because even though she supported various liberal causes, including abolition, suffrage, education for all, she was as critical of the infighting and disingenuity that she perceived in their movement as she was of anyone trying to push any political agenda. So in my opinion, considering her legacy as a pioneering journalist, political dissenter, and let's face it, the epitome of a nasty woman.
The story of Anne Royal reminds me of the story of another groundbreaking woman journalist. That is, you guys ever heard of Nellie Bly?
Yeah.
Had her queued up too.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, I'm glad I got in first.
Sorry.
So, Nellie Bly was an American journalist born in 1864 who was most famous for traveling around the world in 72 days to beat Jules Verne's character's fictional record of 80 days. And that was pretty cool. But more importantly, She went undercover at great personal risk to investigate reports of brutality and neglect at the Women's Lunatic Asylum on what was then known as Blackwell's Island, and which is now known as Roosevelt Island, which is a part of New York City, and which we can actually see outside of the window right now. So it's pretty interesting that it's a place that's so close to us. And it was a horrible, horrible place. But the story of how she feigned insanity to be committed is actually pretty extraordinary. She spent a night practicing expressions in front of a mirror that she thought looked insane. Then she checked into a boarding house where she made a scene telling the other boarders there that she was afraid of them and that they looked crazy. No, you're the crazy one. I'm not crazy. You're crazy.
Sounds like what a crazy person would say.
Exactly. That was exactly her plan. She was very convincing. And she was taken to several doctors who all declared her insane. One said, quote, "Positively demented. I consider it a hopeless case. She needs to be put where someone will take care of her," end quote. The head of the, quote, "insane pavilion" at Bellevue Hospital, which, first of all, sounds like a great name for a band. The Insane Pavilion at Bellevue Hospital, a famous psychiatric hospital, pronounced her undoubtedly insane. Once she was committed, she observed the deplorable conditions and the regular violence that was visited on the patients, and she also made note that many of the patients around her seemed no less insane than she was. Her book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, led to an investigation of the asylum and many reforms, but for all people focus on how amazing it is that she was able to feign insanity, trick all these doctors, and to have herself committed to this horrible place required such bravery, I think the most amazing thing about this story is that at the end of this, she was able to convince them that she wasn't actually crazy and that they should let her leave. Like,
that's remarkable.
That is the most impressive thing that she did. She was managed to talk herself out of an insane asylum, which I'm sure are normally filled with a bunch of people saying they shouldn't be there. I'm not crazy because we're Napoleon. Yeah. All of three of us inside my head.
So getting out of an insane asylum is actually basically impossible nowadays. And I don't know if you've ever read... it's a John Ronson book called The Psychopath Test. It was written in 2011. John Ronson's a great British author, a nonfiction writer, and he basically describes the history of the diagnosis of mental illness in the United States and in the world, and really the kind of jaded history that we have with it. And so the psychopath test is actually, it's a little bit of a misnomer. It's a set of characteristics that if you qualify, or if you check off so many boxes, you're declared, or were declared mentally insane. And so the problem is that many of these things are very kind of mundane. And so like selfishness would be one of the boxes, or kind of narcissism. But it's just, if you accrue too many of them, then you could test positive for being a psychopath. And then essentially the way that it's defined and was practiced in the 70s, even through today, is that if you're manipulative, if you seem calm, if you state a clear case, this shows that you are a psychopath, that you are manipulating your way out of the system. So it is essentially impossible to talk your way out of it now, because any sort of like level-headedness or any sort of like basically clarity in your talk is just a sign that you're being manipulative and that you are in fact like this like mastermind psychopath. And the modern DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that describes mental disorders doesn't use that term. It uses much more kind of specific diagnostics. All of these things kind of have evolved a great way, but this idea that there's a mental illness is still such a huge stigma and is kind of irreversible was true even back then. So it is really impressive that Nellie Bly was able to like turn this on the side and get out of it.
Well, so basically how she did it was that she was on assignment from a newspaper, and the newspaper was supposed to come get her.
Okay. But, I was going to say, someone must know.
Yeah, so it wasn't like she had to sit in front of a panel and be like, haha, I'm really a journalist, not a crazy lady you found in a hotel. No, it was actually, she was writing for Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper, The New York World. And they, he was a very influential guy, and they came in and got her and got her out. Kind of a big deal.
I do, after you two both have described, like, powerful feminists, I have just facts about an old white man who was president. But
which one? I mean, sure. There were 44 of them.
True, we can talk about true. That like we always do.
So John Quincy Adams was a kind of interesting president because in the election of 1824, Adams did not win a majority or have the most electoral votes. And so it was the one and only contested elections.
Hashtag she won more votes.
While we're on the topic. But Adams did neither. impressively. And he, in the election of 1824, was the only election decided by the 12th Amendment where no one candidate held a majority. It was split fairly evenly between 4 candidates, and the House of Representatives had to decide it. And so after a few days, he was elected president. Andrew Jackson said it was a corrupt bargain between Adams and Henry Clay. Nonetheless, Jackson was not president. He ran again in 1828 and famously won by quite a bit. But for 4 years, John Quincy Adams was an unpopular and not popularly elected president. And he had some cool things that happened in his campaign. But kind of most interestingly, after he was elected president, he went back to the House of Representatives and he continued to serve. He's the only president to do that in the history of the United States. All right. Thanks, Emily. And I'll close it out with my fact. And that is about one Edward Carl Frederick Otto. And he is known, or not known, for patenting his design and naming it the Otto Dicycle. And this was perhaps the safest bicycle in history. Picture the world in 1877. Picture men in suits walking around the city, and one adventurous young man riding down the road on a fairly dangerous penny-farthing bicycle. This madness was the world of 1877. Are you guys first familiar with the penny farthing bicycle?
Yes. Big front wheel, tiny back wheel, super tall.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly.
Okay, cool.
Named after not really the ratio, but like kind of the relative size of a farthing and a penny coin.
Huh.
So that 2 different size circles.
Cool.
And so the penny farthing was it was a device that used mechanical leverage, like your body weight, to help you pedal. It had a gear shift, so the chain would move you forward. And so it was like the first kind of major bicycle. And it was eventually, that kind of style was called the ordinary. Now, there's a big problem, which I think you guys might be familiar with right away, of having like a 60-inch front tire on your bicycle, is that it's very easy to just fall. And it's actually not a particularly safe or practical way to move around. And so, but the thing is, bicycling was really popular. So alternatives started to be invented. So there's, Otto also invented actually another, what's called a safety bicycle. And this one was called his Kangaroo bicycle. This had a 36-inch front tire. You sat a little bit further in the back. And I believe it's called the Kangaroo because your feet are pushing out in front of you in a pedaling motion, as if you're on
Just like a kangaroo?
Well, like a kangaroo boxing.
Oh.
So the arms would be
there you
moving.
go.
And so famously, actually, Otto's Kangaroo bicycle, which is funny, if you look up the Kangaroo bicycle, it says it was invented by Hillman, Herbert, and Cooper. And they're the people who mass-produced it. But there are drawings in the name Kangaroo bicycle that looks like it actually belongs to ECF Otto. But so Otto is truly unsung because he does not have a Wikipedia page.
Wow.
And that's like, that means you didn't make it in history.
Yeah.
You're to be forever
That's the
forgotten.
definition of unsung.
And his is kind of a tragic story because this bicycle, which I haven't even fully described yet, his bicycle is really one of a kind. The Otto Dicycle has 2 wheels on the same axis. And so to picture that, imagine that you're in a wheelchair, but this wheelchair, the wheels are going like up past your head, and you're sitting on the axis of a wheelchair, and there are no front wheels. It's a pretty neat idea. However, you might immediately catch on to the problem of this design.
You just spin around and around.
Yeah, it's particularly difficult to stay upright in this configuration. And so there was kind of like mass displacement, something hanging underneath so that you would sit up and there'd be a thing on the back. Some had a tail that would like hit the ground, so if you leaned back, you wouldn't dump backwards out of the bicycle.
Yeah.
So that was all fairly practical. And that weighted rod on the back was the stabilizer bar. But the real problem was you would just fly forward out of it. Like there was literally nothing to stop you from falling forward. And so about 1,000 of these bicycles were ever made. They were never popular. But some of them still exist. And the American Bicycle Museum, there's a first-hand experience of a man who is named Tony P. And he describes his attempt. My first attempt to ride one of these unusual machines resulted in almost falling flat on my face as sitting on the wide saddle and placing your feet on the pedals, I discovered immediately tipped you forward. Giving this result some thought, I resat on the saddle and immediately leaned back, causing the outrigger to touch the ground behind me. This brought the pedal crank up in front of me, so still leaning back, I gingerly placed my feet on the pedals and applied pressure. Lo and behold, I moved. But basically he describes how almost everything you do, including braking, would cause you to fly out of this bicycle. And so as a safety bicycle, it was a bit of a failure. But for purposes that of prudishness, it was seen as the bicycle for ladies and young men.
Because they wouldn't have to be like astride.
It wouldn't
something.
be astride a bicycle, and so they could sit very ladylike with their legs together in an upright position.
Why couldn't they just ride a regular bicycle side saddle?
I mean, I don't know.
How do you do that?
In terms of safety, I don't know if that's any better.
Yeah.
So the auto dicycle has kind of gone down in history as this historic mistake.
Sorry, actually, it hasn't gone down in history.
Yes, history thought it was such a mistake they omitted it. But it's a shame because it is it's a clever idea, poorly executed perhaps, but it is actually very intrinsically related to something that we still use today, and that's the tricycle. And so, tricycle manufacturing, and I found a book from the MIT Press that looks like the driest book called "Of Bicycles, Bake Lights, and Bulbs: Towards a Theory of Socio-Technical Change." This was a misery to browse.
Sounds like the first draft of Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Bicycles, bake lights, and bulbs. No, we can do better.
Gotta zhuzh up the title a little bit.
But there's a clip that says, the tricycle was a very viable alternative to the bicycle in the 1880s and 90s, and not some historical mistake, as it may seem now. Most cycle manufacturers produced bicycles as well as tricycles. And then the author goes on to mention Singer and Company. And Singer and Company was actually involved in a very long-standing lawsuit, some of the legal proceedings I found, with Otto over the design of the dicycle because it was a patent infringement with the tricycle. And so in some ways, he was responsible for the development and manufacturing of tricycles, which kind of led the way for revolutionizing manual transport. Things like bicycles, tricycles, scooters, and the like all kind of came from this revolution of late 1800s manufacturing. And so Singer was still a company. Many of the other companies that used his designs still exist, but Otto is pretty much stricken from the history books.
On the topic of weird bicycles, actually, the Wright brothers, who were bicycle manufacturers, among other things, they actually, when they made the Wright Flyer, they actually flipped a coin to see who would make the attempt at the first flight. And Wilbur won the coin toss. But his attempt actually resulted in a crash that messed up the plane. So a couple days later, Orville got the second attempt and was the first in flight, and a heavier than aircraft. And so actually throughout that day, they would just trade off. And so like the first flight was only like 180 feet, but by the end, I think they had gone like 800 feet or something. So it really like in just that period of like the day that they were doing it, they increased the longest flight ever by like 4 or 5 times or whatever it is, which is pretty amazing. But it is, when you think about it, par for the course in terms of humanity's acceleration of their ability to fly and to go farther and farther. And just something interesting I also found was that Neil Armstrong actually carried a piece of the Wright Flyer with him when he went to the moon. And just to drive that home,
cool.
From first flight in what was essentially a bicycle with wings to putting a man on the moon took 66 years.
Wow.
I mean, that's insane.
I have just 2 last things on old bicycles. So there were other, like some of these names were just really fascinating. So the penny farthing is probably the one that we may know best. I don't know if that's true. That's the one I recognized. But the name for all these kind of road bikes was velocipedes, which I think is pretty cool. And there's still like a little bit of a history of that. And so like bicycle racing indoors is in a velodrome. So it's all like speed. But the velocipede was pretty amazing. There's one that was called the European Bone Shaker bicycle. And I want you, the listener at home, to do this too. I want you to just picture if a 5-year-old had to draw a bicycle, what it would look like. And then you won't be able to do this, but we'll put it on the Instagram. Noah and Emily, I just want you to look at this bicycle. Just tell me how it works.
Where are the pedals?
They're not even.
It's like
The
it has to be
wheels
lying
aren't
on your
even round.
Those are the pedals.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
To use those pedals, it's like you're getting a gynecological exam.
So on the topic of early models of transportation that were also really bad, I looked at some early car models that did not take off for pretty obvious reasons. So one of them I looked at was called the Horsey Horseless. It was not produced, but at least designed and advertised in 1899. And they were meant to solve the issue, apparently an issue, that when automobiles were first rolling out, they still had to share the road with horse-drawn carriages, and horses were spooked by their mechanical counterparts. So the solution to this issue, proposed by the inventor of the Horsey Horseless, Uriah Smith, was essentially a car that looked like a normal car of the time. It looks like a Model T if you look it up, but with a giant fake wooden horse head stuck to the front. So it's basically just like a giant, like gaudy Godfather-inspired hood ornament on top of a Model T. This horse head would also hold combustible fuel to just add to the list of brilliant ideas. Unsurprisingly, it didn't really catch on, and it's not actually clear whether they were even produced or sold, unlike another terrible car that appeared later on in 1911 called the Overland Octo Auto. So if you picture this, it is literally just a car with 8 wheels. So 4 on each side. For
twice as good.
Yeah, that was literally the idea. For a smoother ride, and it ended up being over 20 feet long. A bunch of them were made. Literally no one bought them. So to improve it and make it more palatable, they rolled out a new version called the Sexo Auto, which, exactly as it sounds like, had 6 wheels instead. And unsurprisingly, that one also flopped. But should be noted that the dude who invented both of these, Milton Reeves, also invented the muffler. So at least he did something right.
Oh, yeah. My favorite car of all time, and my perhaps favorite designer of all time is Buckminster Fuller. And he invented a 3-wheeled car called the Dynamax, which it's fascinating because its turning radius is the length of the car. And it just, like, the back wheel articulates completely, and it can just spin around in a circle, like,
wow.
in place. It's just, he was such a, like, different thinker. And so we could do a whole nother show on Buckminster Fuller, and I'd love it.
Yeah.
But he really, it looked like a torpedo, because it's, like, perfectly rounded on all sides.
Like a torpedo?
Sorry. Yeah.
Rewind.
Like when you're playing with your kid and you toss a torpedo.
You're playing hot torpedo.
Hot torpedo? What is happening to you guys?
I merely meant that it was aerodynamic.
There we go. Actually, one more fact to tie in early automobiles and bicycles. The first auto speeding ticket that was given in the UK in 1896 was granted by a policeman on a bicycle because the perpetrator exceeded the speed limit at that time, which was 2 miles an hour, by recklessly flying down the road at a whopping 8 miles per hour.
Wow.
Yeah.
I do have to say I regret the fact that Otto invented bicycles and not cars, because if he invented cars, they would be automobiles.
Just one last thing on the topic of weird bicycles. I also happened to look up the fastest mile on a unicycle, and that is 3 minutes, 26 seconds, and 22 milliseconds, with an average speed of 17.45 miles per hour. And you'll notice that that's faster than the fastest mile runners. And I always imagined sort of a unicycle as a sort of awkward thing where you're never really totally on balance.
Yeah.
And that's pretty amazing because, like, 3 minutes, 26.22 milliseconds is way faster than the fastest mile ever run. I'm not exactly sure what that time was, but I know it's, like, a lot closer to 4 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, the 4-minute mark was kind of like the can men ever break it for a long time, but Roger Bannister did that in 1952 Olympics, I think. So he was the first man under, and now the world record is considerably down, I think, in the 340s. But high school national champions will occasionally break 4 minutes for their mile times. So,
wow.
Yeah, man has come a long way.
But honestly, that just makes my next record even more impressive because I also looked up the fastest mile on a unicycle while juggling. And it's
amazing.
And it's 3 minutes, 50 seconds, and 63 milliseconds, which is, I mean, that's insane. Can you imagine, like, the best runners in the world are running at this pace at the same? I mean, just imagine, like, can you picture, like, a unicyclist?
I
and they're
really
already
can't.
So awkward. But, like, imagine one just leaning forward, juggling at full speed. Like, that's insane to me.
I would love
It's
I
there.
would love to see just the man in the last, like, 400 meters of his race running, and then the guy on the unicycle just goes right by him.
It's just so demoralizing.
He wins by a bowling pin.
And so we'll wrap things up with my quiz, loosely inspired by Unsung Heroes. And I was thinking, what do heroes do? They save. Heroes save.
Got it.
And so today's quiz is all about saving. Things that are saved, things that save, the process of saving, saviors, anything that's saved will be in this quiz. Okay, so question number 1. When we last heard, who owned and operated the Bedford Falls Building and Loan?
Well, that's the guy from
It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
Yep.
What's his name?
It's
Can you
not-
give me his actor name? The name of the actor who portrayed him?
No.
No.
Is that harder?
Oh, no.
I don't remember his
So
name.
frustrating. I haven't seen the movie in ages.
I know it's familiar. I know it's one I would recognize, but I just can't remember it.
Yeah.
But we know it is the guy. It
It's
is
the
the
main
character
character,
from It's a Wonderful Life.
And he sees
He
life.
talks like this.
I know.
It's a
Yeah.
character.
Oh,
He
Savings
sees
and
life
Hall.
without him.
like that.
And there's an angel, and they ring a bell for the angel.
Clarence.
I feel like we've said
Clarence.
enough things about
It's
the
not
movie.
there.
Yeah, you clearly know who it is, but are just without the fact. So
Yeah.
the character is named George Bailey,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
the Bailey
Yeah.
Building and Loan,
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
and is played by Jimmy Stewart,
Oh, okay.
actor Jimmy Stewart.
Cool.
Question number 2. What mathematician who posited a negative solution to the Entscheidungsproblem is believed to have saved between 14 and 21 million lives during World War II?
Alan Turing?
Alan Turing, yeah.
Alan Turing, yeah. So Alan Turing, the mathematician, he contributed heavily to the kind of logic models that helped contribute to the machines that eventually decrypted and decoded Enigma, the German cryptography. And so several years before the war ended, he was able to, or that technology was able to break German code, help inform the movement of British troops, save many lives in the war, and considerably shorten the European front of the war with the Nazis. So good work, Alan Turing. Nicely done. Question number 3. What cryogenically preserved baseball player and the most recent living member of the 400 Club had the highest on-base percentage of all time, meaning that he was safe more often than anyone else?
Oh, I
Yeah.
have no idea.
Okay.
There's no chance I get this.
All right, so I'm just going to put you out of your
Yeah,
misery.
it's not
Just do
happening.
it.
So this
Yeah.
is Ted Williams, baseball player Ted Williams.
I don't know who that is, Rob.
No.
Okay. He is famous not only for being one of the best hitters in the history of the game, as well as being able to take walks and get on base. When he passed away, he was the last living member to bat a season over 400. He had the highest on-base percentage, like 489 was his on-base percentage, which is still the highest all time.
That's one thing about this that is really interesting to me is that in our group of nerds, Rob is the sports guy.
Yeah.
That's really...
Rob's
an-
the sports nerd.
That's an insult to like sports fans everywhere. We were talking about like a very old baseball player. This guy is almost more like Irving Berlin than he is like Derek Jeter, if that makes any sense.
No.
Now
Okay.
you're putting it in terms that I can understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's just But yeah, basically he was a good baseball player and now he's frozen.
Okay.
So that's the takeaway.
Right.
All right, question number 4 for the youth. The Remy Zero song "Save Me" was the theme song to what millennial television series?
The Superman one, Smallville.
Yes.
Oh,
Save
Good.
me.
Yeah, that's it.
But better sounding.
No, it pretty much sounded like that.
Oh, okay.
So Remy Zero, not famous for much else except for the song "Save Me," to which we were introduced Tom Welling, the young Superman in Smallville. All right, 4 questions down in this blockbuster quiz. All right, number 5. What type of savings account is named after a Republican Delaware senator who passed away in 2003?
that would be a Roth IRA.
That is correct. Yeah, so named after the Delaware Senator William Roth. He was a big tax reform kind of guy. And the Roth IRA actually caused a lot of people to invest in this sort of retirement account and created a really big influx of money for the government. So a really, really nice thing for most parties. There are a lot of actually critics of the Roth IRA, but tax reform doesn't happen that often. So we got it. We got our Roth IRA. Invest now. Pay taxes later. All right. Question number 6. You may not have heard of Tervel of Bulgaria, but he is considered one of the 2 saviors of Europe. His army saved Constantinople from an Arab siege in 718, while what other man led a Frankish army to overpower the Arabs at Tours in 732?
That's too early for Charlemagne, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It is shortly before Charlemagne. It kind of set the stage for the birth of the Holy Roman Empire.
Not really.
So this guy, he drove the Moors into and then back out of Spain. But the Battle of Tours was 732, and that was the battle for which he was perhaps most famous. And he had a nickname, the Hammer.
Okay.
But this man was Charles Martel, the Hammer.
Who?
Oh.
I see blank faces. Okay.
No, I vaguely remember that name from maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's a European history kind of question.
I gotta learn more about European history and baseball.
I apologize for. I did not mean for this to be
No, it's
quite
good.
the quiz it is.
Yeah,
but I think this is a good survey of Trivial Pursuit cards from the 1980s. All right. Question number 7. And this is amazing. So there's a great story I've heard about a student, and this is an anecdote. This isn't from online, but this happened with a co-teacher of mine. A student who found a floppy disk around the lab and said, "Look, somebody 3D printed the save symbol," which is just like daggers to the heart. But so it got me thinking. So save symbol is a representation of a floppy disk. What else is an abstraction of something that is now a digital symbol? And can you tell me, what is the symbol that is 2 circles joined on the bottom by a solid line that stands for a voicemail? What is that representative of?
Is it like a cassette tape?
Yeah, that's basically
That's it? Okay.
So it
Oh,
is,
cool. Nice.
is meant to represent reel-to-reel recording.
Yeah, like I was thinking it was something like the sort of whatever, the magnetic tape that just like goes between them.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Because original voicemail recorders were 2 reels of audio tape.
Right.
And when you called, it would activate it, record, and then stop.
Right.
Wow, yeah.
So
It's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so next time you get a voicemail, besides being like, who the hell leaves voicemails? You can say, oh, look at that.
Well, you know what's
I
great
know
now
what
is
this
that the iPhone now will, so you don't even have to listen to it. It transcribes it and shows you the text of the call.
Oh, really?
And it works shockingly well. I'm sure there are many instances of it not working, but I didn't even know that was a feature when I updated my phone, and then I saw it and I was like, this is great. I don't have to listen to all my voicemails now.
Yeah. I like checking my voicemails at the end of every week, and it's 4 calls from my mom. It's like, Bobby, you didn't pick up. Hang up.
Your mom calls you Bobby?
Mom calls me Bobby.
That's so cute.
But it's so it's really heart-wrenching because it's like, we wanted to talk to you. Just 3-second voicemails of despair from my mother, and that's all I have.
Is everything okay at home, Rob?
Yes, it's great. It's fine. Because it's always the first one is like, hi, you didn't pick up, call us back. And then it's like, you didn't pick up. And then it's like, we wanted to talk to you.
Another Bob's Burgers reference.
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
That was good. And we're on to question number 8 at last. So, this is a musical question. What song was written when a band's lead singer, Ivan Doroschuk, was thrown out of a Canadian nightclub for pogo dancing in an unsafe manner?
What's pogo dance?
Safety dance?
It is safety dance.
To be fair, pogo dancing, whatever it is, does sound pretty dangerous.
Yeah, the thing is it's not.
Oh, okay.
So I had to look it up too. I did not know what it was.
Yeah.
Pogo dancing is the act of jumping straight up and down as if you're on a pogo stick.
I think they do that in the music video for that song,
Yes.
too. Yes, okay.
Wow.
And so he did
That's
this in a
amazing.
club, and someone was like, "Hey, stop! That's weird. I don't know. Get out of here,
You can dance if you
please,
want to.
because it's Canada."
You can
And-
leave that club behind.
So yeah, safety dance, men without hats. All right, and that's all we have prepared for you today. Thanks for tuning in. If you do have time, please check us out on any audio platform and leave us a rating and review. And check us out on our social media at Fax Machine Pod on Instagram and Twitter, and Fax Machine Podcast on Facebook. See you next time. Welcome to Fax Machine. Summer's blazing on around us, and so are we here at Fax Machine. You've made it to...
Did you just hear that? Did you just...